All right, guys, so this is 1014 political science. Again, 1014, it would be Wednesday of the week. Checked it first. Seems to be working okay. I guess we'll find out afterwards. Hopefully I'm not here for 54 minutes going through some great lecture only to have it all for naught. At any rate, we did the highlights from the bureaucracy lecture. We're still in this chapter really on bureaucracy, but I want to take this opportunity to kind of pull both Article 1 and Article 2 together with the executive branch, the legislative branch, the executive branch, right down to bureaucracy. And then next week, of course, we get into the courts, which is Article 3. Make sure you have that read before next week. And we'll spend quite a bit of time on the courts. And what a great time to be spending on the courts. We've got the confirmation of a new Supreme Court justice if the Senate ultimately consents to the nomination. A couple of things about that. Obviously, we know that and we talked about this before. COVID sent us all back to our homes for sheltering in place, basically, and doing this online remotely. But talked about the fact that the president, Article 2, as you've read and as we've discussed, Article 2 doesn't give the president wiggle room in the process of nomination when it comes to a vacancy on the court, right? The size of the court is determined by Congress ultimately. This is a lot of conversation about court packing, and this court packing scheme is that's being discussed and even considered. Many would argue by the Democrats if ultimately Chuck Schumer and the Democrats gain control of the Senate. If they gain control of the Senate, there's talk of doing away with the filibuster. You do away with the filibuster. You can, pass legislation, I guess, in terms of creating a larger court. Really, again, Congress would ultimately determine its size, and then the president would then nominate, as the president shall nominate. Shall doesn't give the wiggle room in Article 2. And then with the number of senators necessary to confirm those nominations, that's how you would ultimately pack the court, expand it, and then pack it with like-minded justices who, when I say like-minded, individuals who believe that Constitution should fit the times versus a Constitution that has ideas, and the ideas themselves have been static since they were put in place. Right? The right to keep and bear arms is about protecting oneself from their government, as well as other individuals. The right to free speech is really the ability to kind of speak your mind, particularly about your government or against your government without government reprisal, and that those concepts don't change just because our technology has changed or what the needs are necessarily of the community. They change based on how we amend the Constitution through Article 5, right? The process that was ratified when the Constitution was ratified for changing the Constitution. At any rate, the point being that we have this opportunity now to kind of witness the judicial branch, the proceedings of the judicial branch, and then the makeup. So all those things that we're talking about in terms of judicial originalism, they're coming to height. They're coming to the forefront. They're being highlighted right now in this confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. So good time to be into Article 3. We're not there yet, but I don't think this confirmation is going to be completed yet either. So we've got some time. The other thing I want to talk about today also is that paper assignment. So in Moodle under this week, and I went back and I put at least the first day of the week in there, so we don't get caught up on which week it is versus the date. Just take a look for the YouTube videos that have been posted. They give us a running schedule, running calendar for the class, and then stay up on the class. Remember to stay up on the journal entries unless you did the assessment as was quote unquote mandatory campus wide. If you did the assessment, then we replace those journal entries. And of course, this is for my political science section 90 and my political science section 1. So those are the two sections that were assessed. Okay, so the paper assignment, it gets us into, it's not due right away, but it gets us into Article 3 of the Constitution and changes your role. Actually does what you've been doing all along. You've been writing opinions about specific topics regarding executive orders or originalism. Well, ultimately, that's what your courts do, right? So your courts, they opine. I mean, we call them opinions. Their final decisions are opinions, majority opinion, the dissenting opinions. And you've been offering opinions, and you've been offering those opinions not just bare from shooting from the hip, but also supported by scholarly resources. Again, something that our judges, our justices do when they come up with those opinions. They opine, and then they base it upon precedent or their interpretation and understanding, or prior interpretation and understanding of laws or concepts that attach themselves back to the Constitution. So you're going to be doing the same thing. It's basically just an extension of the journals, what we've called the journals, right, and the positions. And you're just going to be taking a position. However, I'm giving you more information, the tenets of a case, right? A case of basically that's pitting the idea of free speech, free expression, and then causing a ruckus where ultimately, as you'll read, Timmy Smith unfortunately died. Again, you're not going to find this court case out there. Don't try to find this specific case. It doesn't exist. I made it up, but it's the concepts that you're going to be applying to this assignment. They're out there and available to you, right? There's a flag burning component to this. There's there's the clear and present danger component to this. There's the responsibility of the parents as opposed to in terms of Tim's his death falling off the shoulders of his father, what culpability is there. There's a number of different parts of this case that are that you can find some resemblance in other decisions that you can then apply those decisions to this case in rendering your opinion. So there's two pieces of this paper. Again, it's not due till the end of the semester, but there's two pieces of this paper. One is your opinion of whether or not, as the appellate court, whether or not the lower court made the right decision or didn't make the right decision. That's one piece. And then the other piece is answering those 4 questions that I asked you about stare decisis, about your personal judicial ideology, about the idea of judicial activism and judicial restraint. Those 4 questions that are asked. So again, your opinion, and then those 4 questions and how you came up with that opinion. And I'm looking towards the process. How did you come up with the opinion you came up with? What parts of the process affected you most, right? As you were going through and doing your research, were you thinking about your ideology? Were you thinking about the impact that your ruling might have on subsequent cases? Those, I think, are important. And when we start thinking about our courts and you're playing that role of a judge, that's no different than any other role, any other judge plays, the role that any other judge plays. No different whatsoever. They have to make those considerations. They have to approach it from, again, a judicial restrainist or judicial activist. They have to think about stare decisis and past precedent or creating new precedent and what the ramifications and implications are of those opinions. So they're doing exactly what you're going to be doing. And again, but for the law degree, but for the experience in law, the qualifications to become a judge, aren't separated from individual to individual. Anybody has the opportunity or the potential to become a judge, as long as you have that love for the law. And in Michigan, you ultimately need to have a law degree to run for judge. I don't know if that's true of the state Supreme Court or the federal courts, but certainly at the state court level. And which reminds me, as we get into the courts, right, just like the executive branch, just like the legislative branch, Michigan in structure really follows that same 3-branch separation of powers structure, right? So if you have any questions about the paper as you read through it, remember it's not due for a while, so we'll touch on it a couple of times. But don't hesitate to fire me an email regarding that paper. And again, it's in this Moodle section that we're in right now. All right, so we had the opportunity to go into detail about the history of our bureaucratic system, the expansion, and how we've gotten to where we are today. And if we go all the way back and we talk about the beginning of our, right, with the ratification of our Constitution, the ratification of our Constitution is what sets us upon this path of what we call federalism, right? So we have a strong national government, right? And we also have these strong regional units of government, the states, and these two entities share power, right? That's that federal system. It's not unitary, it's not confederal, it's federal. It's a system of shared power. And so that's how we start out. Now, arguably, because the federal government's very new, because the federal government's scope is very narrow, remember we talked about just really 4 divisions within the federal government with its inception. You have the Secretary of War, Department of War, the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, and then the Attorney General. And that was the scope of the federal government, this more perfect union. But they had to give the federal government some authority in those areas because in order to have a military, for example, you needed the state support, right? To have a national military. In order to have a one say, speaking and dealing with foreign countries with one voice, you needed to have the state's support. In order to have one economy and one currency, you needed to have the state's support. And it had to be, again, there had to be some power for the central government to force states to comply in those areas. And again, as we talked about in bureaucracy, the expansion goes now well beyond these. This becomes the Justice Department. These 4 departments includes the Interior and Commerce and Energy and Education. It includes Transportation. It includes Health and Human Services. It includes Housing. It includes Labor. So the scope of the federal government has spun out, and with it, its power has increased. So if we start from the inception of the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution in the 1780s, and then we think about where we are in 2020, these two relationships between the states and the federal government are not how they started, right? Initially, if we want to talk about this as being dual federalism, right? Dual federalism, and then dual federalism looks like a layered cake. And the state and the federal government or national government are separate and discernible. And that's a layered cake. When you take a piece of layered cake and it flops down on your Dixie plate there and you look at it, you can discern the different layers, right? Maybe it's separated by a little frosting, right? And we might call that the concurrent powers, something that both the states and the federal government exercise. Or they might be 2 separate flavors, right? This might be a chocolate, this might be a vanilla. And so you can tell the difference between the 2, right? So I know what state power is and I know what federal power is. And originally, again, though the federal government's powers are extremely important, right? When it comes to the impact of the average individual's life, it was fairly minimal, right? So the federal government, we'll make the federal government down here, and this would be the state. And so the state was really carried the weight of decisions that were being exercised and impacting individuals. Today, I would argue that the opposite is true. I think that the federal government is ultimately driving decisions that impact the state, and really, and if they don't directly mandate that the state does X, they certainly make it hard for the state not to, right? When you attach those federal funds that the states have all come to rely on, you basically have changed this relationship where this is now really the federal government and this is now the state. So we've really flipped this relationship. In fact, we're much closer to a unitary system than we were to a confederal system, right? And so the question is ultimately what happened? How do we get to this expansion? And over time, we get a civil war that helps to answer a lot of that. And then we get a Great Depression that helps to change that relationship between the federal government and the states. We get a couple of proper amendments to the Constitution that change that relationship, give us the income tax, for example, change how the Senate is elected. And that's how we've expanded our process and have deferred now more so to the federal government. I think arguably the Constitution hasn't changed that much from where it started to where it is today, that it hasn't gotten that much bigger, but for the interpretation of the courts and the allowance of the bureaucracy to grow, of the federal government to grow, of the role of Congress to grow through interpretation, right? So the Constitution, one would argue, yes, it's been amended a couple of times. The 14th Amendment, for example, really changes a lot of the that relationship in terms of protecting individual rights, particularly for newly freed slaves, but then putting that in the hands of the federal government and into Congress, and then through kind of these interpretations of what does that mean? How do we protect individual rights? What does commerce mean? And how are we going to interpret commerce? That was a big decision that really helped to grow the role of the federal government into directly impacting the lives of individuals beyond, again, the states, even at the objection of single states or individual states. The only way really to reel that back in is you can hope that the legislature, right, either reinterprets its process and passes constitutional laws that rein the federal government in, or they go as far as to offer amendments, Article 5, offer amendments that go back to the states to change this relationship, or the states themselves can change this relationship again through Article 5 through what's called a convention of the states. Okay, so that's been this change. Within this change, we've also had, as we talked about, the spoils period. And during that spoils period, which really begins in the 1820s and lasts to 1883-ish, we get this growth of the federal government and this recognition that there's a that partisan politics is at play, that the issues are big, and that he who controls the federal government controls the federal treasury, and with that, right, making policies that can financially benefit specific segments of society, and to the victor goes the spoils. We won't rehash that to any large degree. Again, reminder that the Democrat Party has started back here with Jackson, and then in Jackson, 54, in the city of Jackson, community of Jackson, in 1854, we get the birth of the Republican Party. And these parties, in terms of their relationship to the individual, their relationship to business, their relationship to government, big government, small government, big business, small business, the protection of the individual, the protection of the group in terms of equality. These relate, again, what these two parties stand for has shifted and changed over time. And we get really the modern presidency and the modern two-party system in the 1930s with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Great Depression, the role of the federal government changing, and what we would call the modern presidency. And that takes us back to this issue of the court packing. So during this period of time when FDR came in, the New Deal was being proposed. The courts at that time were striking down FDR's proposal as New Deal proposals. So as the ability to expand the federal government, the ability to expand the role of the federal government is being thwarted by the courts. This is where the first court packing proposal comes in. At that time, there were 9 Supreme Court justices, and FDR's plan was to increase the size of the federal bench, the U.S. Supreme Court, to beyond that 9, because it was not able to get the rulings that he wanted to support the New Deal policies, which would really have centralized authority. Well, eventually does centralize authority, and that's what we see today. Eventually, what happened, supposedly, right, one of the justices who was siding with those who you would call the originalists, or those who were failing to see the role of the federal government as FDR saw it. So you had these 5-4 decisions that were thwarting FDR's New Deal policies and that of Congress that was supportive of FDR. And eventually, when the court packing scheme comes out to increase it to 15, and then with these 15, these new 6 members that would certainly be nominated by FDR. So they would obviously be individuals who would approve of or support the New Deal policies and be confirmed by a Senate that was supportive of FDR. One of these judges changes their mind on the constitutionality of those New Deal programs. a stitch in time saves 9. Well, a switch in time saved 9, as the old saying goes. So one of these justices began to find new powers in the U.S. Constitution for the federal government and the executive branch, and boom, the New Deal is put into place. And with FDR's 4 elections, there's a lot of time for him to make the court, through the resignations and the changes in the court, to make the court more supportive of the New Deal. And we know that our judges, they're appointed for life. So once they're in there, as long as they are good, right, for are acting good, as the Constitution indicates, then they can stay there until they choose to step down themselves or pass on. Now, they can be impeached, right? But if they're impeached and removed, then they weren't being good. So, at any rate, the court itself is at 9. It did not get packed during FDR's administration, but it is being talked about when they talk about packing the court. That's basically what they're referring to, the expansion of the court and then seating the court with individuals, because you can't get rid of those who've been appointed already. And if Amy Coney Barrett gets put on the bench, the fear is, and I think it's an unwarranted fear, but the fear is that it's going to be a very conservative, judicial originalist bench, and it won't be as willing to afford the federal government powers that aren't easily found in the Constitution or have somehow become settled judicial precedent. So a little bit of a recap through time, getting us to Article 3. As we talked about, so build, formulate, adopt, implement, and evaluate. Right? These are the powers of government. This is what government does. It's universal. If it calls itself government, it hits these 5 steps in this order. Our Constitution breaks this apart nicely. This is Article 1, which identifies the legislative powers, building, formulating, and adopting. This is Article 2, right? 1 and 2, right? For the execution of laws, for carrying out the implementation. The executive branch will be responsible. The president is the party with which the executive powers are vested in. That's Article 2. And then Article 3 is the courts. Now, it should make sense that when we separate these powers, right? This is power, and this is a power. And I believe we did this in class, one of the last things we did before we broke, and that was that when these 2 powers are equal, okay, what happens when they disagree, right? I mean, if the job of the government is to protect individual rights, to solve problems, to structure, to decide who gets what, all those things that government is given the responsibility to do, what happens when one branch and the other branch are in disagreement? The one branch basically with its power says, I want you to do X. That's its power. And checks and balance, we give the executive the power to say, no, I'm not going to do that, right? That's the veto. That's a veto of implementation is not going to happen. That's the veto of the plan that's been adopted to solve the problem that's been identified, right? But if that veto is overridden, or this executive says, yes, right, I'm going to carry this out, okay? So X is what is the plan. That's what's been adopted. The president, maybe it's a subsequent president down the line after the law has already been signed into law, or the bill has been signed into law or overridden. If it was a veto, then the responsibility of the president is to carry out X, right? This is how it works, right? We identified a problem. This is the solution. Your job is to execute it. We give you a bite at the apple. You can say no to implementation. That's the veto. We might be able to override that veto of 2/3 the House and 2/3 the Senate. Say, no, you're going to do this. But if we can't override the veto stands. We got to try again. But the other thing that might happen is the president may say, hey, this is great policy. I'm going to sign this. It becomes law. X has been passed. X has been, right, it's been supported, signed into law, adopted as a plan, now implemented as a plan, X to X. Now, what happens if one of two things happens here? the president who's in place, who vetoed it, maybe had their veto overridden, decides they're not going to carry out X, they're going to carry out Y. Or a subsequent president down the road doesn't like this law, right? Doesn't think it's constitutional. And so they decided that they're not going to carry out X anymore. They're going to do Y. These two things are not the same, right? These are not the same. The powers are equal, but what's being carried out is not what was passed by Congress, right? And what was adopted at some point in time, or excuse me, accepted at some point in time by the president. Adoption takes place here. Acceptance, implementation takes place here. So these two are not the same. Well, who's going to decide who's correct here, right? If the executive comes out and says, no, in my interpretation, this is what Congress passed out. They passed out Y, I'm doing Y. And Congress says, no, we passed out X. This is what we passed out. We passed out X, and you're supposed to be doing X. You're not doing X. Yes, I am. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. We can do this again and again and again and again. Boom. That's why you have the courts, right? Major function of the courts is to come in and to evaluate between what was passed, right? What did Congress say, right? And what's being carried out. That's the big reason for the courts, that evaluation. Someone has to come in and make sure that there's equality here, right? That there's equality between what was passed, adopted, and then what was approved to be implemented, all right? That's the major feature of the courts. Now, Marshall, go all the way back to Marbury versus Madison, brings in another component of the courts, and that is who interprets the Constitution. Well, everybody interprets the Constitution, but when it comes to a final interpretation, what is called judicial review, the courts have taken, maybe by design in the Constitution, maybe through some judicial activism, but the courts have taken the responsibility of saying, this is what the Constitution allows for. We decide what the Constitution allows for, right? We opine on that, and our opinion, right, is the opinion that counts. So even if Congress passes X, and even if the president carries out X, all right, so it's X to X, the question still remains, could Congress even do this? Could Congress even pass this law and do this? And that is often a question that's asked. And because of the 14th Amendment, we've pushed all policies, all questions of government, all questions of governing to the basis of the Constitution. So it has to fit the Constitution, right? So a state law can't run afoul of the Constitution via ultimately the 14th Amendment. And so who's in charge then of determining whether any state law is constitutional or not? And that can, doesn't have to, but it can. Every law has the potential of making its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, can be determined by the U.S. Supreme Court. So really, the courts have become very, very powerful. Powerful in what the bureaucracies do, powerful in what Congress does, powerful in what state governments do and state laws, and potentially even between individuals. Some civil infraction between individuals. A business owner, for example, does something that diminishes the rights of another individual. Boom, can make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, right? And often does, particularly when it comes to businesses and lawsuits against businesses. All right, so even when, for example, cigarettes. Think about that. The cigarettes and tobacco and the FDA and government oversight. It's been involved really from the inception. The acknowledgement that cigarettes cause cancer, and yet we still get a court case all the way up to the Supreme Court. Into the federal courts anyway, and then allowing these lawsuits of wrongdoing of the tobacco companies, of pushing something that everybody knew ultimately at some point in time that they were quote unquote cancer sticks, and government allowed those tobacco companies to continue to move forward, and then ultimately. It was government that supported those lawsuits that then come back to ultimately benefit the states and education and everything else. Kind of a weird full circle experience when it comes to the tobacco companies and lawsuits. And of course, now we're running headlong, full speed ahead into the legalization of marijuana and the commercialization of marijuana. It'll be interesting to see if somewhere down the road, maybe, I don't know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we come back and say, gosh, that marijuana is not very good for people. And so we need to sue all of these marijuana companies now because they knew ahead of time that they shouldn't have been peddling this stuff. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it might. So that's how the courts ultimately fit in, right? So we have the legislative branch that builds, formulates, and adopts. We have the executive branch that carries out the policies as adopted. And then we have the executive branch to evaluate, one, whether what's being carried out was what was adopted, and two, whether or not this was okay to even begin with via the Constitution, via judicial review, right? So judicial review through the courts, right? Okay. So, and then in schematic form, I can take this back out. All the way back out. In schematic form then, when we build, we're identifying a problem. So a problem comes in. Maybe it comes in from you, right? Maybe it comes in from a lobbyist. Maybe it comes from the legislators themselves or the executive or someone in the executive branch or someone in the bureaucracy. But a problem comes in, and in order for it to really formally be worked on, a legislator has to say, yep, that is an issue. Right? And so then that legislator oftentimes will work with outside researchers, with individuals who may be invested in this issue to come up with some initial start, some bill, some first step, some way of solving this problem identified that fits within the legislator's ideology, right? You don't expect conservative or Republican legislators to come up with solutions that create more government or higher taxes. You don't expect that Democrat legislators are going to come up with policies that diminish equality or somehow diminish the role of government per se. So the ideology has to fit for the solution, the legislator, as we're taking care of this problem. They may not agree there's a problem here. But a problem comes in, the legislator does agree, then the legislator needs to come up with that solution, the initial solution. That solution then starts out as theirs and then becomes, right, the chambers, right? And then from there it goes to the committee. So it's introduced and then it's referred to the committee. And this is where the majority of work will be done, right? So now it's the committee's bill. Started out the individual's bill, now it's the committee's bill. And so a small number of the House members and controlled by the majority will determine whether this is a good bill or bad bill, what it needs. You need to change it, not change it, or more likely than not, we'll allow that bill to die. Most bills will ultimately die in committee. If it's going to become law, however, it has to make its way out of committee. And then we've got a couple of days of debate where, again, now this is the full chamber's bill. Right, so if this is the House of Representatives, we're talking about the federal government. Now it's 435 members who are looking at this legislation, thinking in terms of how does it affect my constituents, right? Does it fit within my ideology, what I was elected to do, how I feel, or what I feel the role of government is? And then as those questions are asked, maybe it needs to be amended, substituted. Maybe it gets a little pork added into it. It'll get some pork added into it. And then it ultimately be voted on, all right? We don't have a unicameral system. Bicameral at the state, bicameral at the federal government. Nebraska is the only state that has a unicameral system. I kind of envy Nebraska for it, but in other words, there's just one chamber, right? But I do also like the fact that more hands, more eyes are taking a look at this legislation to make sure it's really ultimately necessary. Heads on, we'll call this, if this is the House, this will be the Senate then. It gets introduced, and this bill that comes over as the House bill now becomes the Senate bill, right? And it'll still be called House bill, but I mean the senators are the ones who are now going to work on it and decide whether it's a problem, whether it's the right solution, whether the solution needs to be fixed. So it's introed into the Senate and sent over to committee. Again, good chance the bill will die in committee. It's very hard to get legislation passed all the way through. Remember, this is a numbers game. So whoever controls the full Senate, if it's the Republicans, which it is currently, then they'll control every committee. Over here, it was the Dems that controlled the House, so they control every committee. And if this legislation is going to become law, it has to make it out of committee. Then we got a couple of days of debate. Now remember, in the Senate where we hit the filibuster. If we can get beyond a filibuster and we actually vote on it, we might decide to amend it, so and or add substitution from the full Senate floor, and then eventually we have to vote on it. Okay, now here's the rub. X came in, right? So the legislature, the House of Representatives within the legislature, it has a version of the bill. This is what they want. This is the problem as they see it, and this is the right solution to that problem. The Senate has to agree with that solution, that exact solution. If these two are not equal, then the legislature as a whole hasn't adopted anything. The House has adopted their version of a solution to this problem, and the Senate has adopted their version, which is going to be different. All right, we'll make this Y or make it Z. All right, very different. It's different than what was introduced in. And with that difference, then you've got to get reconciliation between the two. If you can go back to the full chamber and get these changes adopted, great. But more often than not, you're going to find this bill in what's called that conference committee. In fact, count on the conference committee. It's just the way the system works. Okay, so we go through both chambers and then it works its way into the conference. And then technically, it's the conference committee that's supposed to reconcile these two bills, not introduce new amendments, new substitutions, but reconcile the differences between these two bills. Right? And if they can come up with some compromise between this X and Z versions of this bill, right? Maybe the compromise is 7. All right. If they can come up with a compromise, whatever that compromise is, boom, now we've adopted. That means this is billed, identifying the problem. This then is all formulation, B, F, A, right? So we've gotten to the adoption. From adoption then, we know this is where it goes into the bureaucracy. So the executive branch now takes the ball, right? In order for this to be implemented, has to agree to implement it. You know what's been adopted. We need agreement for implementation. That's where the signing into law comes in. If it's a veto, it can go back to both chambers, but the likelihood that's going to get passed over vetoes is pretty tough to do. So now we've got this bill, right, is now become law with the signature. And as it becomes law, then it goes into the right department for its administration. And then through that department, through middle management, right, all the way down to that street level bureaucrat, the individual responsible for fixing the problem or carrying it out, right? The street level, the person that you and I are most likely to come in contact or see, because these are the individuals who are actually carrying out the policy on your behalf and my behalf. So if we started up here and we said that the problem is the quality of our roads, right? And so we want to fix our roads. Maybe we have a new piece of legislation to try some new technology in our roads. And so the bill then is, okay, we're going to appropriate money for this new technology that's going to fix potholes forever. And so that goes in, and then there's debate. And you can bet, right? This is where the lobbyists come in and say, hey, no, we've been doing asphalt forever. It works great. And the cement companies come in and say, hey, why don't you try cement? Cement lasts a little bit longer. Yeah, it's a little bit expensive. And then you've got the lobbyists from the company that comes in and says, hey, but we've got this new product that will last forever. We can patch these roads, fix these roads, do it one time, and it's done forever. And guess what? It doesn't cost anything more than cement. You got these lobbyists applying pressure, these key officials in government, right? And then ultimately, like I said, if it's going to make its way out, it's got to pass out of committee and not die. This is where you and I might come in and testify as citizens with our broken axles or our broken rims and come in and go, wouldn't it be nice if we had these potholes fixed forever, perpetually forever? And that's where, again, you can inject yourself into this process to shape policy along the way. Not only identify a problem, hey, these potholes are problems, but help to bolster the decisions of our legislators by going in and testifying and constantly applying pressure right? Even if it's not your legislator to introduce the legislation, you can apply pressure to your legislator. So maybe when it gets out of committee, they vote for it, vote to pass it. You got to stay up on that. And that's where lobbying, again, the lobbyists, the advocates, those organizations, they become valuable because you can support them and then they can do the work of watching legislation, right? Regardless, it comes out, there's a couple of days debate, and then we pass it on to the Senate and the process happens again. Right? Well, I never thought it would get this far. We better lobby harder against it. Hey, there's a real good chance this is going to get passed out of the Senate. We better go out there and lobby for it. And then as individuals, you and I, again, we're now in the second chamber, push, hope, prod to get this out of committee and then over to the full Senate. The full Senate then votes on it. Okay, it's great, Bill. We've got this new process for filling potholes. That's the solution to the problem. We're appropriating money to the company or companies that produce this product. And we need to now implement this. The executive looked at it, said, hey, this looks like good policy to me, doesn't make me look bad, and they sign it and it becomes law. Now we're into the bureaucracy, right? So from here, from the president, it would go into transportation, right? It's a transportation thing. And then from transportation, it goes into the roads. Instead of waterways or airways, it's a road issue, right? And then from the roads, maybe it's road design, construction, road safety, one of those divisions, all the way down to the individual, right? Who then becomes responsible for filling these potholes with this new product that has been identified by Congress, shepherded through all the way to the executive, from the executive down through the bureaucracy, through middle management to the individual that you and I are going to see on the street working hard to fix those potholes. All right. So that's how those two branches come together in the schematic. Yeah. Okay. A little cleaner in those lecture notes online, but this is the process. And then where do the courts come in? Okay. So the courts might come in and say, look, you're still filling these with asphalt. We passed a law that said we're going to replace asphalt, and you're still using asphalt. You're not carrying out what we adopted. And the executive may say, oh, yeah, we are. The way I read this legislation is that we could still use any product we wanted to. This was just an option for us. It wasn't a requirement for us. Something like that. And that's where you get the courts involved, because the executive and the legislature are equal branches. And the court comes in and reads the legislation or says, okay, this is the intent of the author. Right? That's their job, to look to the intent of the author. It's not their job to come in and go, hey, I like asphalt. Or if we don't use asphalt, we're going to be putting a lot of asphalt companies out of business. That's not the job of the court. The job of the court is to take a look at the duly passed legislation, what the intent was, if they can come to the intent, somehow get to the intent, what the intent was, and then apply that to what's being carried out and make sure that those two things match. Right? That's actual role of the court. So when we have the court come in, they're asked the question, and look, it doesn't have to be nefarious. Maybe the executive truly believes how they're reading the legislation is what the intent of the legislation was, right? But when there's a challenge to that, it's the court's responsibility, and because of judicial review, their interpretation is the interpretation. Whether it's Affordable Care Act or quote unquote Obamacare, whether it's Roe versus Wade, whether it's how to apply the Second Amendment. It's the court that should get to the intent of the author and not simply place in front of those elected individuals their own interests or what their beliefs of what is good or bad. Again, there are those who argue against that, but it's hard to argue that you're an originalist if you're not attempting to apply the law as originally intended by the authors, or ensure that the law is being applied as originally intended by the author. As we said, and is a good axiom to apply to anything that's ultimately written in any kind of conversation, debate, discussion. There's only one proper, true way to interpret the written word. Only one correct way to interpret the written word, and that is as the author intended it to be interpreted. That's it. Everything else is a guess. And if you don't particularly in the situation of the when it comes to law or the Constitution, attempt to understand the intent of the author, then you're doing a disservice to the role of properly evaluating the laws. All right, so that's in schematic. That's how these pieces go together. Make sure you're reading Article 1, Article 2, and now Article 3. And then we'll get into the court and actually break the court down a little bit more and talk about these different ideologies when it comes to the court, when it comes to how best to progress a country, whether it's through a foundation of law that has certain principles of to change the law if we don't care for it, or a more malleable recognition of what is good versus what is bad, and always moving towards the perceived good, regardless of what the law says. Those are two very different approaches, but both have merit. And we can discuss those as we come back and discuss Article 3 in the courts. All right, guys. Again, don't hesitate. Fire me an email if you have any questions about this. I don't think it was chipmunk voice, but we're going to take a look. And if it's chipmunk voice, then you're going to get the highlights again of what we just talked about. But I think we got it down. So I'll post this right after. And then for you, please make sure that you're taking a look at the paper assignment. It's not due right away, but take a look at it. Make sure that you understand it. And we'll go from there. All right. And let's sign off. Boom.